Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. I have a special show for you today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce my guest today on the Steel City Underground podcast. He is a contributor to Steel City Underground, runs his own site over at SteelersGrind.com. His name is Eric Herrmann. Eric, how are you today?
I'm good, Joe. How are you doing today?
You know what? The weather's finally turning around here, so hoping to do some swimming, especially through this week. I mean, it sure beats all the rain and cold that we had. So,
oh, yeah.
You know, I'm definitely happy for that, and, you know, everything else is going good over here. So
Good.
Yeah, so Eric's on the show today to discuss his portion of a collaboration article that we did just a little bit ago. I call this segment Dual Opinions, and we had the way too early Steelers predictions, and this is the offense edition. So we will have two parts. This will be part one of a two-part broadcast, I guess, if you want to call it. And we're going to talk about the offense today and I don't know, it's really early to be making predictions. We're just getting out of the OTAs. But you know what? What else do we got to talk about, right?
Yep.
So I guess I'll start off here with talking about the biggest addition to the Steelers offense and basically the biggest acquisition. And we didn't have very many. So I think me and you, Eric, actually went with the same guy. And I'm going with Ladarius Green, obviously, because he was pretty much the biggest tight end, or not biggest by size, but the biggest tight end signing across the league. He was the biggest free agent at that position.
And I think it was him, and Kobe Fleener was pretty big.
Yeah, I don't care about him.
I mean, he made more money than Green. Like, I'm not saying he's better, but he got overpaid. He got lucky. Yeah, you know, and that reminds me of like Brock Osweiler or somebody like that too. I don't get. Sometimes I just don't understand like the business aspect to it. Like Fleener, I don't know, man. And it's, you know, we're talking about the Steelers and not the Colts, but you know, Dwayne Allen was like the man over there in Indianapolis, and Fleener was just kind of like a fly by night. So I don't know, but that's the way some people felt about Ladarius Green. I don't feel the same way. I guess some people are talking about, you know, he has a little bit of an injury history. He was a little banged up last year, and he just had this surgery to hopefully correct that. And apparently if the Steelers were that concerned or worried about it, they wouldn't have signed him in the first place. So, and, of course, Heath Miller, he's retired now, so that leaves a big hole. And I talked about Jesse James the other day on the show, and I think Jesse James is going to be fantastic too. So this is really exciting because Ladarius Green actually brings an element much like Martavis Bryant brought to this offense. Yeah, I think Green can be really special because he can play the role Heath played as just the tight end in line, and then he can also split out wide like Martavis Bryant. And he's like a big athletic dude. He ran a 4.53 40 when he went 6'6", 238. That's really impressive. That's really dangerous for defenses.
Yeah, and you know what? That's kind of I think Martavis Bryant's probably just a little leaner, a little faster. Obviously, the route running and that. But, I mean, again, when you have somebody like this out on the field, like, who do you guard? I mean, you put Le'Veon Bell, a lot of times they're going to put him out in motion and line him up in the slot, too. And I just see them doing the same thing with Ladarius Green. This just reminds me of, like, Jimmy Graham with Drew Brees in New Orleans. I mean, I'm pretty excited for it myself. And like you said, he's 6'6". I mean, the guy's just a monster. You pair him with the 6'7" Jesse James. I just don't know that it's all about creating mismatches. And in the Steelers' offense, certainly now that they have Ladarius Green, certainly have that capability of doing so. That's why I guess we both agree that he's the biggest acquisition. Not that we had a whole lot of guys to choose from. I mean, they drafted, 2 offensive players, and you know, neither of them are really a lock to make the team, but I would think that Gerald Hawkins does, and DeMarcus Ayers is going to have an uphill battle making the roster. But outside of that, there really weren't any major acquisitions. You have Ryan Harris, who's probably going to be a swing tackle, maybe compete with Alejandro Villanueva, but that's just about it. And we're actually going to talk about a few of those guys coming up here. But the next category was the overachiever, which some people, like I know me and you were discussing about whether to even use this label for this. And I just simply mean by that is if you just took everybody as an average of what you expect out of them, who is going to rise above that level that's expected of them? Who do you have, Eric?
Well, I have some players that's kind of polarizing. Some people, like myself, are a fan, some aren't, and that's Darius Hayward-Bay. And I think he's going to overachieve just because I know some people are saying he might not make the team. The Steelers don't have a role for him, but I don't really think Tomlin would hand out a 3-year contract to someone that's going to be like a fringe player and not play. We even saw last year when Martavis Bryant went out, Darius Hayward-Bay was the guy who stepped up over Sammy Coates, and he got playing time. And he wasn't perfect. He made his DHB mistakes. Like, doesn't have that many routes he can run. He dropped some balls. But I think he can be a solid guy for us in, like, a rotation role with him and Sammy Coates. So I'm excited for DHB. I think he's going to be a good guy for us.
You know, I do like Darius Hayward-Bay. I like that pick. I like the 3-year contract. They were going year to year with him. This was a guy you wanted to lock down. You had that feeling that maybe Martavis Bryant could slip, so it was definitely an insurance policy with the front office signing him to that contract. And, you know, I actually put out a video. You know, it's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's on my new Vine account, and I have like that Martavis Bryant catch that he made against the Bengals, that flipping, diving catch where he was in the corner of the end zone. And if you watch that video, Darius Hayward-Bay runs a little short out pattern that just he just took the defender with him, and Dre Kirkpatrick was stuck one-on-one with Martavis Bryant. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, Martavis Bryant isn't going to be there this year. Martavis Bryant's big target. But we were just talking about Ladarius Green. They could certainly do the same thing with him. But by all means, they're going to try and everyone's going to try and blanket Antonio Brown, which we found that's practically impossible. Nobody could discover the way to cover him. Even that Denver Broncos defense had trouble covering Antonio Brown in that. Well, he didn't play in the second game, obviously, but I took a little bit of a different angle on this. I had already mentioned him just a few minutes ago, but Big Alejandro Villanueva, I think he may have already hit that peak, but if he stays consistent or above that and protects Ben Roethlisberger, if he ends up being the starting left tackle and blindside protector, I do think if he's healthy and he's a 16-game starter, that would be a very welcome surprise from a guy that was just brought in off the street. Nobody really knew what to do with him. He played 4 different positions when he was in college at Army, and then he didn't even play since 2009. Before, I think it was 2014 that the Eagles made the headlines, and they signed this Army Ranger, and they have Villanueva there, and he tried out as like a defensive end, and then that didn't work out. He bulked up, and I guess what happened really, the legend of this story is that Mike Tomlin, they had a preseason game with the Steelers and the Eagles, and I guess he looked across the field, and saw this guy that was just a man amongst boys, and he's just towering over everyone, and he was intrigued by who that was, and you see that quite frequently. I think that happened kind of with Jordan Todman, just ran all over the Steelers last preseason when he was with the Panthers. He got released before the 53-man cuts and ends up on the roster. So, I mean, you know, one man's trash is another man's treasure, and I mean, this really could be treasure because, I mean, he started 10 games already last season. They were playing him in the first game of the year when they opened up against the Patriots. He was coming in on the jumbo sets, and being that he was a tight end, you never know. Like, you have Ryan Harris, who's a swing tackle. You never know if they're going to just make him one of the eligible receivers when they bring in that extra tackle in the jumbo sets. They might be able to throw him a pass. I mean, it's pretty cool, I think.
I mean, Landry Jones tried to do that.
Yeah,
well, that fake play, Allie was the target, but
well, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just as long as it's we don't put James Harrison in the backfield and try and throw him the ball. I don't know how you get miscommunication on a professional level like that, but wasn't that a mess when that one happened? So I'll take the lead.
It's hard to disagree with this pick. I mean, not only is he an awesome story with all his time in the Army, but we saw actual steady improvement from him over the year, which is like really cool to see. Because some guys, you throw them in and they just have standard plateau level of play, but you actually saw him improve every game. I know early on, I think there's that Bengals game, they were throwing like stunts at him and throwing all this elaborate stuff, and he was just all over the place. But near the end of the year, he was like had a lot of solid protection.
Yeah, absolutely. You just jogged even my memory from, I think it was the Hall of Fame game against the Vikings when I first saw him in action. I think, there's some of these guys you really speculate about this time of the year, and you don't have a chance to see them until August. And when you finally do see them, you're either yay or nay. And I was really yay on Alejandro Villanueva. And then, when I was talking about the whole thing with Jesse James, a lot of people went sour on him because of a really bad performance in that Hall of Fame game. And, of course, you can't gauge everything on the preseason, but it was still kind of cool. I said, hey, this guy could be a solid backup. And now he might be a solid starter. You never know. But
it's funny, too, because one thing I forgot about till now is the Steelers signed, I think, Brian Mihalik. But he was another, like, D-end from the Eagles. He's 6'9", 320, and they're going to try and convert him, too, to a tackle.
Yeah, that's definitely it reminds you of what, like the Hogs or the Great Wall of Dallas, where you got into just putting these mammoth human beings on your offensive line, and it just blows my – it reminds me of I went to a college football game with my uncle. I was like 9 or 10 years old. We traveled over – we were following, believe it or not, Youngstown State, which is my alma mater. I'm alumni from there. But I was 9 years old at the time, and that was when Jim Tressel, who was the coach at Ohio State after his stint with Youngstown State, he went to 6 national championship games as a coach there. And this was right at the beginning of their run. And they used to have this really big offensive lineman. His name was Ray Miller. And my uncle brought me up to him because, college, it's like 1AA. So they're real accessible guys, and you just walk right up. And Ray's there, and I think Ray is in the same category like you said. I believe he was like 6'8", 309. And like people say, he had legs for arms. So I mean, it was just a massive human being. And I'm not a small guy by any means, but I mean, you're a 9-year-old kid, and you're like looking up. I don't even think I could see like the top of his hairline or anything. So I couldn't imagine. It was really funny because even like Mike Adams, we expected Mike Adams to be kind of what Alejandro Villanueva has become. I mean, he far surpassed Mike Adams, who's no longer on the team. But Mike Adams, I remember him standing out there. I think it was maybe in the preseason, and they bring LaRod Stevens-Howling out into that same huddle, and it just was like one extreme to the other. I couldn't imagine him on a teeter-totter because Mike Adams would just be – his seat would be on the ground if you could picture it, and Stevens-Howling would be up in the air. I mean, that's pretty much the same thing with Dree Archer too. I mean, kind of tinier, smaller, those little scat backs that Todd Haley likes. Which, you know what, that's a good segue for the underachiever portion. This is the player that falls below what our expectations might be. And my pick is a running back, actually. And it might upset a few people for me to say that D'Angelo Williams is the guy I'm going with here. And it's just strictly a matter of there's only so many balls to go around. And I just don't know that D'Angelo Williams will get those opportunities. Now, he got those opportunities early in the season and late in the season, but we saw that period of time when Le'Veon Bell was healthy and he came off the suspension. And when Le'Veon Bell was in there, we were all thinking, hey, you know what, D'Angelo Williams, I think that second week against the 49ers was the one where he just like crushed it. He had like this just amazing game. And then Le'Veon Bell comes in there and everybody's thinking, oh, there's going to be like this two-headed monster. They're going to be, really sharing carries, and that didn't happen. So I think a similar situation could happen again this year because you're going to put your best player out there. I just don't see D'Angelo Williams putting up the same amount of numbers in 2016 unless, of course, Le'Veon Bell gets injured again. And I just, you're
don't talk about that.
Yeah,
don't talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to shut my mouth now.
So what you're saying, Joe, is you don't think he's going to underachieve like his performance. You think it's just like statistically and like playing time he's going to underachieve.
Yeah, and you know what? He's older, and not that that's bad. He's in a good spot. He's in the perfect spot, actually, to just spell Le'Veon Bell. Maybe they get up maybe they get up like 20 points in a game and they just pull Bell from the game and put D'Angelo back there, or maybe he's a situational player. But I don't expect him to go out there and run for, 100 and some yards, 2-3 touchdowns like we saw. I'm going to end up pulling up that statistic here in a second. Why don't we hear who your underachiever is, Eric?
Okay, well, kind of like how your pick made me kind of upset because I'm a huge D. Will fan. I know mine's gonna make some people upset because I chose Sammy Coates.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's
I
interesting.
know because I even saw when you tweeted out some of your vines the other day, like people were saying Coates is gonna elevate. He's gonna be amazing. Everyone's gonna even forget Bryant. But I'm a big fan of Coates. I think he's gonna have a good year. I just don't think he's gonna have a huge breakout year like some people are saying. Like I think he'll be a great deep threat, and he'll get all those short routes like he did in Denver. We'll get the ball, get a lot of yards after catch, and I do think he's gonna have a consistent role in this offense and contribute. But I think there's a good chance he's gonna like split a lot of time with Darius Hayward-Bay early on, and I just don't think he's gonna have like the amazing season that people say he will. And I'd love to be wrong. If he comes out and he's amazing, I'll be so happy, but I'm just hesitant.
Yeah, everyone was anointing Martavis Bryant before he ever played in a game, and it took him about 7 or 8 games into the season to actually play. And what was this? 2014 was his first season. I'm trying to look it up here while I was looking up the other numbers for D'Angelo. Here we go. I got Martavis Bryant's numbers here. He played in 10 games in 2014. And let's see. I'm going to try and go across here and not screw this up. He had 48 targets, but he only had 26 catches, 549 yards. He had the 8 touchdowns. He was the touchdown machine because...
Oh, yeah. That was incredible.
Well, they threw a few bombs to him, and he had a couple double-score games. I mean, he's definitely was a red zone threat, but at the same time, he wasn't exactly lighting it up all over the field. I don't really think they were doing a lot of the reverses with him just yet. So... it's well-founded that the veteran may still have the edge, even though Sammy Coates is a second-year player. He didn't even see much time. The most we saw of him was that video that I posted with I think it was 37-yard reception against the Denver Broncos in that divisional playoff game. So, it's almost like when you get a new player and you get real excited, everyone's anointing him as the next guy, and you have, is it Richard Mann, I think that's the wide receivers coach, that's just been pumping out, like, it's just like the wide receiver factory down there in Pittsburgh. They just have all these guys that are capable, and you just expect that the next one's just going to step up, and, that doesn't always happen. So yeah. Let's see here. I found D'Angelo Williams' numbers, and I'm actually going to look for his splits. So... He was active for all 16 games. I mean, that was a good thing. He started, I guess, it says 10 of them here. I hate that because, like, starting is sometimes just labeled as, hey, this guy was in, like, the very first formation of the game, and then he subs out. Let's see. And D'Angelo ran 200 times for 907 yards and 11 touchdowns. So... in contrast, you had Le'Veon Bell only playing 6 games, and he had 113 rushes for 556 and 3 touchdowns. So obviously, Le'Veon Bell, I mean, that's pretty. Le'Veon Bell just killed it for those 6 games, just looking at those statistics. And I just don't think that D'Angelo Williams is going to be nearly a 1,000-yard rusher. If he doesn't get hurt in that Cleveland game, I wonder if he does get 1,000 for the year.
I think you would.
Yeah, I think so, too. So, I mean, it's just well-funded. It's not that, Eric or I are saying that Sammy Coates or D'Angelo Williams are going to be – let's put it this way. If you're an underachiever in this offense, I'd still think that you're better than what most of the NFL teams are producing out there. Mm-hmm. So, I think some guys would kill to have a D'Angelo Williams or Sammy Coates in their lineup, and we're looking at them as backups and guys that are just going to kind of be role players here. So,
yeah. It seems that we both kind of agree they're not going to be bad. Their stats just aren't going to be as big as people think they will be.
No, not at all. It's very tough to say. There's just so many mouths to feed on this offense. You just, aside from Antonio Brown, and I always talk about fantasy football because I love fantasy football. I know some of the listeners are, they're half a dozen one way, 6 the other on it. But if you were building a team and you're selecting like your fantasy players, I don't know who else you take on this team aside from Antonio Brown. Maybe Le'Veon Bell, but I remember everyone was a little leery about the injuries for Le'Veon Bell weren't necessarily his fault, and I think people just need to remember that when you have a helmet coming at you at however many miles an hour and crushing your knee, what are you going to do about that? It's kind of like Marquise Pouncey. The guy has bad luck too. With that said, we're going to talk maybe about another lineman here. Who's on the hot seat as the Steeler with the most pressure to perform this season?
My pick is kind of controversial, but I think it kind of makes sense. I have Alejandro Villanueva. But I'm not saying he's on a hot seat as to be replaced by Ryan Harris. My angle here is more, I think he's on the hot seat in order to be like our long-term guy. Because as I kind of wrote in our article, the Steelers weren't very secret about like bringing Russell Okung and like searching a lot of these offensive tackles for free agency. So I think they kind of are just kind of keeping one eye on Alejandro Villanueva and just kind of keeping an eye on like all the future guys. Yeah, and we all know they drafted Gerald Hawkins this year, and it's really up in the air where he's going to play. Like I've heard rumors of him playing guard, him like being in both left and right tackle. So at this point, I do believe the job is Villanueva's. I think we'll keep that job all year. I just think he's going to have to perform really hard this year in order to try and secure that long-term tackle role.
No, and that's okay because, I was expecting him. He could be the overachiever, and it doesn't mean that he's going to be or necessarily he could be on the hot seat. I mean, we didn't really give like a whole lot of flack towards him or, well, you know what? Alejandro Villanueva wasn't playing at that time, but I think it was Cody Wallace who totally got blown up on the play in St. Louis where Ben Roethlisberger got hurt. So a lot of times, like, the guys aren't necessarily – they kind of fly under the radar, you know what I mean? So there wasn't really a whole lot said about Cody Wallace getting beat there and more or less just talking about maybe a dirty hit. But in the same aspect, one guy that, like, just kind of has flown under the radar ever since he was drafted. I mean, he was drafted and there was a lot of hype on him. He has this Sammy Coates type of hype. He had this Martavis Bryant type of hype, and that's Marcus Wheaton. If you remember, Marcus Wheaton was brought in as a third-round draft pick right after the Steelers lost Mike Wallace. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty much expected when you did the measurables. And I think this was probably one of the first articles I wrote over on Steel City Underground, was just talking about, did we forget Marcus Wheaton was the replacement for Mike Wallace? And Marcus Wheaton at no time has really become the Mike Wallace type player. Now, we saw he put up a lot bigger numbers over his last 6 games, including that one huge game that he had against Seattle, which was kind of eye-opening when you take a look at the players that are in that secondary. But again, it's that finding the mismatch type thing. And that's where the mismatches were because the Seahawks were so focused on trying to stop Antonio Brown or stop Martavis Bryant that Marcus Wheaton was the guy that was finding himself open. So Marcus Wheaton had that big game. He had like 200-some yards receiving in that game and the touchdown or maybe a pair of touchdowns. And that's another one. I got to look that up because I don't have it here in my notes yet. I believe I had it in the article or one of the articles I wrote. So what it really means, the other part of this hot seat is that Marcus Wheaton is now in a contract year too. So it's going to be a little controversial. It's kind of like when Emmanuel Sanders was in the contract year, and would Emmanuel Sanders step up and blah, blah, blah. And I believe he was a restricted free agent, and then the Steelers opted to keep him for another year. I guess the story behind that, or the legend is that Ben Roethlisberger begged the front office to keep Manny Sanders for one more year. And then, of course, he went and cashed in over at Denver. So I don't know, though, that Marcus Wheaton is even quite on the same level as Emmanuel Sanders yet, or if Marcus Wheaton could maybe raise his game to a level, or maybe the pressure will be on Marcus Wheaton to raise his game to a level that Martavis Bryant was at least perceived as having before he was suspended for the whole year.
Yeah, I think Marcus Wheaton's a really interesting guy in this offense because he's proved he can play, like you said, with those big games. And we've seen like flashes of big play ability throughout his career. It's just a big question. Can he be consistent? Or like, is it even possible for him to be consistently great in this offense? Like, are there enough balls to go around where Marcus Wheaton can actually like play a major role in this offense?
Yeah, and you know what? I'm wondering about that myself, and I'm going to pull up the game logs here in a second for last season. And Marcus Wheaton here, let's see, Marcus Wheaton was targeted 79 times, had 44 catches, 749 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Now, the whole of those mostly came from the Seattle game on, where he had 9 catches in that Seattle game, 201 yards, and a touchdown. And then he ended up scoring out of his 5 touchdowns for the season. He had 4 of those in the last 6 games, of course, against the Indianapolis Colts, and just like 3-catch game, 4-catch game. He had a 6-catch game against the Broncos when the Steelers came back and beat them, and then 3-3 against the Ravens and the Browns. So it's like he kind of like pokes his head in at times and then disappears at other times. Now in that other In the divisional game against the Broncos, he had 5 receptions but only 30 yards. So he was on a lot of those short patterns, with the exception of that one long pass that kind of just bobbled like off his face mask to open that game. That if he would have caught that, man, the Steelers would have probably been in the AFC Championship, even aside from that Fitzgerald Toussaint fumble that, ultimately, I guess that cost them the game in ways, but, it is a team game. So I saw an article about that somewhere today. It was somebody that had interviewed Fitzgerald Toussaint. I can't remember who it was now, if it was Mark Cabali, one of the Trib guys, or maybe one of the Post-Gazette guys like Bouchette or somebody interviewed him. And, he said he was trying to put that behind him. And it's like, well, quit bringing it up. You know what I mean? Everybody else had pretty much forgiven him. I mean, what do you expect from a guy that wasn't even on this roster to begin the season? You know what I mean? So, but anyways, Marcus Wheaton on my hot seat, Alejandro Villanueva on your hot seat. And then, aside from the hot seat and the guys that are under the pressure to perform most, we were talking about who's at most jeopardy of losing their roster spot. And I kind of went with a guy that just got signed that's been bouncing around, I don't know, like how many different NFL teams over the last few seasons, and that's David Johnson, who formerly was a Steeler, had his injury history, but he appears to be one of these versatile guys that could play a fullback or tight end, and he seems to have been signed to fill the role or the void that was left behind by Will Johnson signing with the New York Giants in the offseason. So just like last year, I was kind of surprised that the Steelers kept both Rosie Nix and Will Johnson. I don't know that there's necessarily a spot for sure for David Johnson. He's going to have to impress in this off-season, headed into this preseason, and, of course, stay healthy, or I think he's going to be a casualty.
Yeah, and see, I'm the opposite of you. I have Matt Spaeth as my roster bubble. I don't know, for some reason, I could see David Johnson making this roster because he is that hybrid fullback and tight end role. And so if, say, Rosie Nix goes down, we all saw how that affected our run game. He'd be able to step in that fullback role, and he's also be able to play that tight end role. So the Steelers offense is all about versatility, and that's just something Matt Spaeth doesn't have.
Yeah, and you know what? David Johnson isn't going to be leaned on to catch a lot of passes. I think Will Johnson just had a handful of grabs last season as well. And even just looking at what David Johnson did over the last few seasons, when he was here in 2011 was his best season, where he had 12 receptions, 91 yards with a touchdown. And then after that, he's really only had 24 receptions in his entire career. Very sparingly used in San Diego, unlike Ladarius Green, who was used quite a bit, despite them having a Hall of Famer in Antonio Gates, even though Ladarius Green was the de facto starter for the first 4 games of that season for San Diego last year, with Gates being suspended. So I think there's a lot more upside with a player like Ladarius Green. David Johnson's just kind of here. He may just be a camp body. He may be there to push Matt Spaeth because, like you, I think that Matt Spaeth is getting up there in age. Despite him being a very good blocker throughout his entire career, maybe Father Time is finally calling. That does happen with just everyone. And like I said, that I said this the other day too, this happens with everyone, not just in the NFL, but just myself just getting out of bed, like things crack and pop. So, time just kind of catches up with you, and maybe the Steelers have the foresight now to maybe not hold on to a player 1 year too long and maybe just get rid of them when their time's up, maybe a year sooner, you know what I mean? So they're not stuck holding the bag as they had been in the past with some players.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I do think regardless, they're going to keep one of these two because since Jesse James and Ladarius Green are both kind of young, they're going to want one veteran blocking tight end so they have someone reliable they can throw in.
Yeah, Jesse James, I think, is only 22 years old now, or he's going to be 22. So, I mean, he has like a very promising future, and he could end up being a steal as a 5th-round draft choice. It's just one of those things where they like to criticize Kevin Colbert, but he finds these players and they just end up being gems. And then you have some like the 3rd-round pick, Adree Archer, who For some reason, like Brandon Boykin, I had to bring the obligatory Brandon Boykin comment up. These names always have to appear on the podcast, or else I'm not happy. I may even get all out and buy a number 13 jersey just for the heck of it. So
they're probably cheap. So
yeah, but you know what though? A lot of people don't like Landry Jones, and they wanted $900 for one of his game-worn jerseys at the Fan Blitz, and I put that out there. It's one of those things that just blows up when you post it on Facebook or you send out a tweet, because everyone has an opinion about Landry Jones. Like, what do you expect out of a guy? He's like, the third string QB, and it's kind of like the same thing with like David Johnson or Matt Spaeth for that matter. If they end up keeping, and they have enough spots, it's just a matter of how many wide receivers are the Steelers going to keep. And I did a show on that the other day. They have 11 in camp, and then they have all of these linebackers, and even for the 11 wide receivers they have, and they have several of them that are going to be on this roster bubble, they're not as much in danger of like some of these guys like David Johnson and Matt Spaeth. You would expect to have their foot in the door and make the cut, unlike maybe an Eli Rogers or a Shaquem Phillips on the wide receiver end. But I think those guys could make a push for the Steelers to keep maybe an extra wide receiver, or like you have, Feeney and Matakevich that were drafted this year, and you still have Chiquillo. So you still have like a lot of these linebackers too. And it just seems like, what spot are they going to keep, an extra player at more than others? And I think we both kind of agree, depending on the versatility here, the tight end depth chart, they may only keep 3. It just depends on whether or not they keep 2 fullbacks, which would make that spot for David Johnson. Or does David Johnson make that push to maybe release Matt Spaeth? That will be interesting. But I think this is our last topic for today, and it is the X factor. It will be, who is the breakout star with the Steelers offense this season, Eric?
Well, this is a guy we just talked about, but I have Marcus Wheaton. And I know I wasn't really ringing his praises earlier, but I think of all the guys, I think he has the most potential to be a breakout star. Because like I kind of mentioned earlier, he's flashed it. And we've even seen it with Emmanuel Sanders. Like I wasn't really like hoping for him to come back. I was ready to be done with him. He was just kind of like frustratingly inconsistent, and he'd make a play, then drop a ball. And then he goes to Denver, and I have no idea what happened with him. I don't think anybody does. He's a superstar now.
Well, according to Manny Sanders, it was Peyton Manning, who I guess prepares more than Ben Roethlisberger, or whatever that idiotic comment was that he made. He owes Ben Roethlisberger like one of his paychecks. He should buy that man an expensive watch or a car.
Or that Landry Jones jersey.
Yeah, well, he could afford it. I can't. So with all that money he's making, I mean, at least maybe, you're thinking about that, and you got some of these guys that are in camp or whatever. I wonder if their jerseys are worth $900 too. That just blew my mind. The Marcus Wheaton jersey was actually $1,600, believe it or not. And yeah, they both had the white away jerseys, and I'm going through the rack, and I think they may have had Mike Mitchell on there too. And Mitchell's was like $2,200 or something, if I recall. I mean, that's just some crazy stuff. But I'm going the opposite with you. I'm still sticking with the wide receiver, and the same thing. I was saying to temper your expectations for Sammy Coates. But I don't know. I could see Sammy Coates coming in here, maybe not to start the season, just like you said, because Darius Hayward-Bay is the veteran, and they may just stick with it. The Steelers sometimes play it too safe, and I think they might just play it safe at the beginning of the season, put Darius Hayward-Bay out there, and slowly work Sammy Coates into that rotation. But you know what? I could see Sammy Coates doing, just that one little clip, and it's only one clip. He only caught like 2 passes the whole year. But that one clip in that Denver game is just, he almost looks like he learned from being behind Martavis Bryant and Antonio Brown. He had that nice little, what am I looking for? I'm trying to think. I want to say like he come around like a hook. I keep thinking button hook. He comes over with a button hook. You button hooked me, and then he just breaks. He makes a nice little move with his hips, and then he shakes a tackle or two and makes a big play out of it. So you're hoping that you see more of that out of Sammy Coates. And of course, like I said before, with Richard Mann making all of these wide receivers into pretty much superstars and working with them. I mean, he's been in the league for 31 years, but he's only been with the Steelers, I think, since 2013. So he's helped put together these Antonio Brown record-setting seasons. And, of course, Todd Haley has worked with many receivers throughout his career, of course, over with the Arizona Cardinals for some time with Larry Fitzgerald and Anquan Bolden and all of those guys. You have to think that, that maybe Sammy Coates could be the guy that ends up. We wanted to say maybe I should have put him in the overachiever section because maybe he will be more than what we expect. I don't think maybe that he puts up the same numbers as Bryant, but I still think Sammy's going to put together a solid season.
I wouldn't oppose that. If he goes out and is amazing, like I said, it's perfectly fine with me. And one thing I think is actually funny, this isn't super relevant, but if you go on NFL.com, how they do their draft profiles, Sammy Coates, his NFL comparison was Martavis Bryant.
Was it really? What? I did not know that. I mean, that's pretty cool.
I know. I always thought that was really funny.
Yeah, so we're talking about Marcus Wheaton actually being drafted as the replacement for Mike Wallace. Sammy Coates is brought in. Everybody's like, why are you drafting a wide receiver? If you remember last year, everybody was like, why do we need a wide receiver? Why are we wasting this pick? Now everyone has him as kind of like, hey, this is the guy we're going to throw a parade for this year. So I really do hope it works out for this young man. I do think, I always say the sky's the limit, but I really do think in this offense that he has breakout potential. And if him and Wheaton both have those seasons, just look out. We were talking about Ladarius Green. I talked about Jesse James on the last show. And the one guy we're not talking about in this particular broadcast, but it's Ben Roethlisberger's the one that's going to be throwing the ball to all these guys. What kind of season is he going to put up? We're going to have to talk about that maybe on the next one. But in part 2, we're going to go over our way too early defense edition picks. So, Eric, until then, thank you for taking time out of your day and joining me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad all your fans didn't request that you never bring me back. And they didn't say they hated me, so...
And and nobody complained about there was floors creaking. I think there was a siren in the background.
My stuttering and all that.
There was just that one. That was the second train wreck as opposed to the one I did the other day with the Jagoff neighbor's grandson cutting. And you know what? I want to put the edit, and I talked to you about this the other day too. When I talk about grandson, I just mean that my Jagoff neighbor is old, and this grandson's like a high schooler. So he's certainly... he's not like a 9-year-old. We wouldn't let 9-year-olds run the lawn mowing equipment and maybe chop their foot off or something. So, but, he's just out there banging things around. And I'm just like, I'm just looking for some quiet time to record the show. And it was just, aside from that and all the other technical difficulties I went through, I think we finally got the kinks worked out. Once again, Eric, thanks for coming on the show with me. And for those of you who aren't already following Eric over on Twitter, Eric, what's your handle? It's just Steelers Grind?
Yep, just at Steelers Grind.
Yeah, no underscores or anything like that. And you'll see us chatting back and forth and retweeting each other quite frequently. So just hop on and give Eric a follow. I know he would appreciate it.
I would. He's not lying.
And ladies and gentlemen, that will wrap it up for part 1 of our way too early Steelers predictions. Hope you stay tuned next time. Until then, be safe, be good, and I will catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.